in Disarray. Let me ask you right off the bat, why did you write it?
Well, I didn't know, Paula, when I wrote it, who was going to be the president. I simply knew that this was going to be the inbox that would greet whoever was the 45th president of the United States. A lot of these trends had been long in the making. Some had been more recent. But the bottom line was that whoever wins an election, they can choose just about everything. Their running mate, their policies. The only thing they can't choose is their inbox that's going to greet them. And what I wanted to do was talk about what would greet the next president, and just as important, how we got from the optimism of 25 years ago to something that, shall we say, is decidedly other than optimistic. And then in the last part of the book, I talk about what is it we should and should avoid doing about it. From a question that had been bothering me while I was giving the lectures and afterwards, which was, why is it that things aren't better in the world if what usually determine history is largely absent? And by that I mean, if great power, competition, and conflict were quite muted, why was it still such a disorderly, or to use the word I use, why was it a world in disarray? And it was the solving of that puzzle, which I did walking around Central Park, which is the way I think when I write, that essentially told me, okay, I've got a book here, and I can explain why things aren't working better than they are, what explains what's similar but also what's different about this moment in history. And then again, I can explain how is it we arrived here, what were the forces that were structural, what were the things that we essentially did to ourselves. And then I knew I had to be somewhat prescriptive. You can't write a depressing book or a sober book and just say, that's it. I felt some need to suggest what could be done about it.
Well, we're going to get to the substance of the book in a minute, but I want to ask you a few more background questions. I noticed at the beginning of the book that you dedicate it to several of your former teachers. What influence did they have on this particular topic, if any?
Well, the teachers at Oxford who I worked with, and those are three of the teachers I mentioned here, had tremendous impact, probably Hedley Bull more than anyone. Hedley was an Australian. He became the professor of international relations at Oxford when I was a student there in the 70s. And Hedley later wrote a book called The Anarchical Society. And I talk about the book in the text here, and as the title suggests, at any moment in history, the world can best be understood as the balance between forces of anarchy, which is pretty self-explanatory, and forces of society, where nation states essentially agree to some rules and follow them. And what's revealing is this balance. And I find that the single most useful framing for any take I may have on history or international relations. So Hedley had a tremendous impact on me. I mentioned Albert Harani, who was a great historian of the Middle East and wrote a fantastic essay once about the crisis of 1956, about Suez in the Middle East and Hungary in Europe. And that essentially ended the European era in the Middle East, and the superpowers took over. And it got me very interested in transitions from one historical era to another. Also worked with Michael Howard, the great historian of war. And then I had two earlier professors I mentioned. One was my first foreign policy professor, and the other was the professor who taught me religion. And that's what got me to the Middle East. And in some ways, in those five professors is the explanation of what really launched me and got me going on the career path that I'm still in.
With people immediately embracing it, grasping it, understanding it, and you don't have to go to the subtitle. Let's go to the first part. You divide the book up into three parts, and your first part traces, as you put it, the history of international relations, starting in the mid-17th century and through two world wars, and then on to the end of the Cold War. And the thesis that you primarily put forward is, you say that there was considerable continuity in how the world worked during this period. Describe that. Why was there this continuity? I mean, history was different in each of these periods. You point that out. But what was the continuity that you saw throughout these periods?
There are a couple of features, and I think you've got it exactly right. One was that nation states were the principal actors on the world stage, to use the cliche, on the chessboard. That a lot of history was about great power competition that spilled over into confrontation. If you look at the 20th century, you had two extraordinarily costly world wars, as well as a Cold War. And a lot of the structure of the world, such as it was based on this idea of sovereignty. The idea that borders were significant, that they defined nation states, countries, and that there was a deal out there that we won't try to change your borders by force if you don't try to change ours, and we won't mess around inside your territory if you don't interfere inside of ours. So it was a kind of live and let live society. Now, this wasn't self-standing, and when there was peace in the world, it was largely because there was a balance of power. And when there wasn't peace in the world, it was because one way or another the balance of power broke down and one or another country saw advantage in trying to change the map. But so for me, to answer your question succinctly, the continuity was nation states, great power competition being the principal driver or shaper of history, and the centrality of sovereignty as the organizing principle. To me, the most fundamental lesson is that it's necessary but not sufficient to have a shared understanding of what others have called and I call legitimacy. It sounds a bit academic, but legitimacy is essentially the idea that we agree on what the rules are of international relations and how they're to be set and changed. So on one hand, you need legitimacy. And then secondly, you need a balance of power, because it's inevitable that one day or another, some country will get to a point where it won't like what the map looks like. It won't like what the chessboard looks like. And if it can't get its way peacefully, it is going to be tempted to act coercively, essentially with military force. And that seems to me, the basic lesson is that you need this set of rules, you need a process for setting and amending them, but you also need a balance of power in order to lock them in. Because again, it's inevitable that you will always have what Henry Kissinger called in another context, revolutionary states, that if they see an opportunity to change things, will do just that. It's relevant in a couple of ways. Here we are now, roughly a quarter of a century since the Berlin Wall came down, since the end of the Cold War. And I would argue that several things are happening. One is that there is less consensus than there was, if there was that much to begin with, on what the rules of the world ought to be. Exactly what ought to be the principles that organize the world, what ought to be the behaviors, shall we say, that are acceptable and those behaviors that are discouraged. I think there's growing friction between, in particular, Russia, to a lesser extent China, and the United States and others, including Europe. I think the balance of power is weaker than it was. NATO, in many ways, demilitarized after the end of the Cold War. Russia did many things, but it is clearly not demilitarized. Indeed, that's the principal instrument of Russian foreign policy. China has remilitarized or militarized in significant ways. So there's been certain shifts in the balance of power, in some ways commensurate with the changing balances of economic wealth. You've had the rise of all sorts of non-state actors, most dramatically the Al-Qaedas and the ISISes, who now can also wield significant power. You've got medium states, the North Koreas, the Irans, who can be a real factor in their regions. And then above all, I think there's globalization. And you've got these enormous flows of just about everything, from viruses, whether they're real or computer, to guns, to drugs, to greenhouse gases, to the components of missiles or bombs, to hack, to the things that hackers would send around the world, to you name it. Essentially, anyone and anything that goes now across borders with tremendous speed and in tremendous volume. So I think the old rules, the ones that to one extent or another helped us through 4 centuries, have essentially been overwhelmed by this combination of globalization, this dissemination of power into all these actors, state and non-state alike, and the rise of some new powers that aren't totally comfortable with the distribution of arrangements in the world and the rules such as they are. So when the Russians start talking about not having rules or the end of the old order. I think this is their way of saying, we're not comfortable. We think what exists out there is biased against us. It's there to help the United States and its allies. And as the guy said in the movie, we're not going to take it anymore. And that's what I think we're beginning to see.
So very struck in particularly the third section. You not only talk about your primary thesis, but you dig down and you go into the issue of preemption versus preventive action. I think it's worth going into this because that also undergirds, I think, your thesis and looking at what is to be done here and how you do it. Give some examples of where preventive action is relevant and preemptive action is relevant to a new world order.
Sure. Let me set the stage. I think there's a consensus out there, and it's been in place for decades, that the world ought to do whatever it can to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. And you have the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed initially in the late 60s. I think it came into force around 1970. And we've limited the number of nuclear countries in the world with nuclear weapons right now, as best we can tell, to 9. The 5 original, the US, Russia, China, Britain, and France, as well as India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. We do not want to have a world of lots of nuclear weapon states. It would be extraordinarily dangerous. It would increase the chances these weapons were used, and that would be awful from any and every perspective. What the world hasn't been very good at is necessarily dealing with countries that ignore these principles and go ahead and get nuclear weapons themselves. Because again, we've already gone from 5 to 9. And one of the challenges is say, what do you do about a North Korea? Well, North Korea now has several nuclear weapons, and it's quick developing ballistic missiles that could take them with over significant distances with considerable accuracy. So it's quite possible, if nothing's done, sometime in the next 4 years, while Mr. Trump is president, you will have a North Korea that could actually launch a missile that could deliver a nuclear weapon against the continental United States. And if we don't want if that reality to come to pass, the question is, how do you head it off? Well, one approach is through diplomacy and sanctions, and that's the one we've been trying for decades. And my view is there's nothing wrong with trying it, but I don't see there's any reason to suspect it will succeed. At the other end of the spectrum is to live with a North Korea that can do this. And that would mean through some combination of deterrence, saying if they ever did something, we would obliterate them, and having defense against missiles. But again, that doesn't necessarily fill us with comfort, given how erratic or even reckless North Korea's leadership is. Well, then the question is, can you use military force or cyber to disrupt what it is they're doing? And there's 2 international law schools here. One is called prevention, and that is where you would take action against what's called a gathering threat. And the other is preemption, which is when you would take action against an imminent threat. Very different standing under international law. There's a lot of support for the latter, for preempting. If, for example, we received intelligence that North Korea was 2 hours away from launching a missile with nuclear warheads on it, that is considered legitimate under international law to preempt, to prevent this imminent threat from materializing. There is, however, very little basis in international law for saying, we're worried in 2 or 3 years North Korea might reach this point, so we're going to attack them now to prevent them even getting close. And the question is then, how is it you decide what it is you do? Where can you build international support? My own guess is you could probably build a considerable degree of international support for acting when you had receipt of so-called imminent warning, when it was just minutes or hours away, something happening. I don't think, though, there would be international support for a world of constant preventive attacks. And the reason isn't bad, because people see gathering risks everywhere. And we wouldn't want to encourage a world where if Russia saw a gathering threat in one of its neighbors, or China saw a gathering threat in India, or India saw a gathering threat in Pakistan, where people constantly use force on the basis they were preventing some danger from coming to pass. But that's the sort of conversation we may well be having in 1 or 2 years, so it sounds highly abstract and academic, but my guess is it could become very real.
Well, you also cite, and I'd like to share this in the book, you reference the National Security Strategy that was published in September 2002 by the administration of George W. Bush. You say the document made this clear, stating that, quote, in an age where the enemies of civilization openly and actively seek the world's most destructive technologies, the United States cannot remain idle while dangers gather, unquote. There you go on. Prevention, in principle, provides a means to disrupt a program before it produces nuclear weapons, or even if one or more weapons exist, to prevent the expansion of an arsenal and, more ambitiously, to destroy those weapons that do exist. So this is obviously I think, a very crucial matter, and certainly as it is playing out relative to the question of North Korea. Where does China fit into this picture relative to this very question?
I'll come back to China in about 30 seconds. This is, by the way, the basis, say, of Israeli action, first against the Iraqi nuclear reactor years ago, and then against Syria, what looked to be a Syrian nuclear reactor plant, that the Israelis were acting against a gathering threat, not an imminent threat, and that's what it was they did. So there is precedent, just to be clear, for preventive strikes. I think in the case of North Korea, the Chinese don't want us to use this kind of military force, and indeed, I think it's one of the things that motivates the Chinese to put more pressure on North Korea. Probably 80 to 90% of North Korea's imports and exports go in and out through China, so China has considerable influence. What holds China back from using all of its influence over North Korea, though, is it doesn't want to destabilize the country. I think it's worried about seeing a united peninsula that's close to the United States and in the American strategic orbit. So China's trying to influence North Korea without bringing it down, to put it bluntly. And so far, at least, that hasn't been enough pressure on North Korea to get it to back off its missile or nuclear programs. I would make this the principal priority in the U.S.-Chinese relationship. I would clear the decks, if I could, and make sure we didn't have problems or friction with China over trade or Taiwan, and instead really focus on this issue, because I don't think I'm exaggerating in saying this could become the principal national security issue facing the United States over the next 2 to 4 years.
United States. What is the role of the United States in all of this? You certainly posited as an important player on the scene. Looking in this world order 2.0, what role do you see the U.S. playing?
The short answer is the U.S. needs to play an active central role. The world won't organize itself without us. When we pull back, good things tend not to happen. People shouldn't misunderstand me. I'm not arguing for American unilateralism. We've got to do things with partners. There's virtually nothing we can do better alone than we can do with others. I also don't think it can be our goal to remake the world. I was against trying to remake the Middle East in our image in Iraq or Libya or anywhere else. So I think we've got to be realistic or more modest in what it is we can achieve. But the bottom line is, whatever degree of disarray is there in the world now, there'll be far more if the United States doesn't play a large leading role. And that would translate into keeping the peace in Europe, so making sure that NATO is sufficiently strong, that Mr. Putin is not tempted to do elsewhere the sort of thing he did in Ukraine. I think in Asia, we've got to, again, be there to reassure our allies so they don't feel the need, among other things, to have nuclear weapons of their own, to reduce the chance of a conflict over territorial disagreements, maybe to deal with a North Korea. I think in the Middle East, we've got to be active to push back against the terrorists, to reassure countries that are standing up to Iran, which really is on a major push for regional primacy. I think we have to take the lead, working with others and setting up the rules for how should cyberspace be governed, what should be okay or not okay when it comes to using force to deal with terrorism or with weapons of mass destruction. Bottom line is, again, the world is not self-organizing. It won't take place without us, and if we pull back, one of two things tend to happen. Either others defer to powerful local countries, and that could mean Russia in Europe or Iran in the Middle East or China in Asia, or they'll take matters into their own hands, and you'll have a kind of a international self-help society where, rather than deferring to us, like the Saudis, the sort of thing the Saudis did when they invaded Yemen, they'll take matters into their own hands, or they'll increasingly arm themselves because they won't have confidence in American guarantees. And that seems to me a recipe for reduced American influence and reduce stability on the world, all of which will blow back on us because, again, we can't insulate ourselves from what goes on out there. One way or another, disarray in the world will undermine the American economy and the American society.
Isn't it also because there really isn't another country or group of countries out there to take this on? You yourself, and I'd like to read it, you have a great quote, "No other country or group of countries has either the capacity or the mindset to build a global order."
Has the virtue of being true. I agree with whoever wrote that, and I think it was me.
Yes, as I said, I'm sharing.
Right.
Yeah, you stated very succinctly.
And it has the virtue of being true. There is no alternative, and China's not ready and able to do it. Russia is more of a tearer downer than a builder upper. Most countries, though, are too concerned with themselves, with narrow self-interest. But at the risk of getting ahead of ourselves, it's one of the things that worries me about the articulation of an American foreign policy based on America first. That seems to me to be a step in the wrong direction. I want to see the United States play a large role in the world, to order the world not as an act of charity, not as an act of philanthropy, but as an act of necessary self-interest. And that when we act to maintain the peace in Europe or Asia, when we discourage countries from proliferating, say, nuclear weapons, when we promote trade, these are all things that work to our advantage. And the good news is that the costs of doing any or all of these things is far less than the benefits. The return on investment of American world leadership over the last 70 years has been fantastic. Anyone's stock portfolio should do as well. And the things that have gone wrong at home, and yes, there's things that have gone wrong. We haven't done what we should do with education, or we had the financial crisis. These things are real, but they can't be blamed on what we were doing overseas. You can't blame the Iraq War for how we failed to sufficiently regulate the economy leading up to 2007 and 8. So I worry that there's increasing rejection, or at least resistance, to a large American world role, which turns out is affordable and is not hurting us at home, but is delivering good things for us abroad, which in turn helps us here at home.